The Politicrat is brought to you by the great people at Anchor. Anchor is such a great place to go if you want to get started in podcasting, and it's easy and it's free. Anchor, marvelous stuff, marvelous. And I'm so grateful to the folks at Anchor for getting me going with The Politicrat. If you want to get going and be heard on Apple, on Spotify, and everywhere podcasts can be, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Welcome to The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Memorial Day, Monday, May the 25th, 2020. Memorial Day is here, and this is a very significant day, a very significant day. A day to reflect and honor the sacrifices of those who never came home, who fought for the United States of America, who thought that they were doing their patriotic duty, and they were. They risked everything. They sacrificed everything. They were the bravest. They were the fearless. They were the proud. One of the most patriotic things that anyone can do is to put their lives on the line for the sake of defending their country, to put their lives on the line for their country. And it's very clear to me that each of the individuals who have never come back from combat did something very patriotic and brave. It's one of the ultimate things that anybody can do. So on this Memorial Day, one that of course is very different from most of the others, if not all of the other Memorial Days that we have had in the United States, I think it's good to reflect, pause, remember, honor, and salute those individuals who, for a cause bigger than themselves, boldly, bravely, and fearlessly put their lives on the line for the country that they fought for and believed in. Some thoughts, by the way, on a couple of other subjects, or at least one other subject, when I return.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'm a bit puzzled. You've had this long chat with Dominic Cummings. You said he went where he could get childcare. I thought he's now saying he didn't receive any childcare, but did all the childcare himself. You say he drove up the road when he was about to be incapacitated. He didn't know that. He couldn't know that. Could he? And you say, more alarmingly, really, you say he was following instincts. The rest of the country was following rules, not instincts. Are we now all entitled to follow instincts? Where will that leave it when a tracer goes round to someone and says, you have COVID, I need you to isolate?
Well, Gary, as I said just now, the guidance makes it very clear that where you have particular childcare needs, that has got to be taken into account. And as I've said, I've looked very clear. I've seen a lot of stuff in the last few days about this episode of self-isolation by Mr. Cummings that does not seem to correspond remotely with reality. And as far as I can see, he stuck to the rules, and he acted legally and responsibly, and with the sole objective of avoiding such contact as would spread the virus.
He got the virus probably in the train, in the car, didn't he?
Well, his objective was to stop the spread of the virus, and he behaved in such a way as to do that. Can we have Charlie Cooper? No, we're going to go back. Sorry. Thanks, Gary. We're going to go back to Ian Watson of the BBC.
That was Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, yesterday, responding to a question, not convincingly, by Channel 4 News journalist Gary Gibbon, who I think asked the most pointed questions, and I think that all the other press should continue to do that. That was a shambolic press conference yesterday. Boris Johnson not giving any explanations at all, except to say that, well, Dominic Cummings, who is his chief advisor in number 10 Downing Street, behaved appropriately, legally, and responsibly. There is a lockdown going on, in case Prime Minister Johnson was not aware of it. Millions of people in the United Kingdom are observing the rules. And what this press conference was about was that back in April, Dominic Cummings and his wife took a car ride up north in the United Kingdom, in England, up north, drove up, went to two different places, including Barnhill Castle, I believe, or Barnham Castle. I forget the exact name of the castle. But there was a stop-off there. There was a stop-off in County Durham. I think that may well be in the same place, or maybe not. But the fact of the matter is, there were two different instances where Dominic Cummings had broken the lockdown, which was for people to stay inside. And there really was no excuse for him to do this. There are people who have said that they have seen Dominic Cummings, that they saw him in April. We now have, up to this point, at least 20 Conservative MPs who have called for Dominic Cummings to be sacked, to be fired for breaking the lockdown rules, the rules that he helped actually promulgate. Boris Johnson has done a shoddy job of leading through this pandemic. And I think it's important to remember that now nearly 38,000 people in the United Kingdom have lost their lives to this coronavirus. And I think that should be and must be the focus of anything that's going on. While there is understandable anger about Dominic Cummings, and I share that anger from lots of my fellow compatriots across the pond for one person doing something that they were not supposed to do and everybody else having to abide by the rules. So there's a double standard. And while I also share the view of the Conservative MPs that Dominic, and many, by the way, including Conservative newspapers like the Daily Mail, which is predictably the Tories' flag-waving newspaper, one of them, I think that Dominic Cummings should go. And while I share all of those agreements with the aforementioned, and that it is a scandalous outrage that Cummings has not left the building already. I have to really be honest with everybody who's listening to this, and it would be nothing less than honest, is that this is a almighty distraction. And I know that sounds crude, but in my view, this Dominic Cummings situation is an almighty distraction by someone at number 10 to take the focus away from the fact that now in the UK we have at least 38,000 people who are no longer with us because of this virus, and principally also because of Boris Johnson's failure, deliberate failure to lead. That is the way I think about this. Dominic Cummings did this in April of 2020. We are now almost at June. We are 1 week away from the month of June. So this was at least 6 weeks ago and almost 2 months ago. And the notion that this would only just come up now over a weekend, literally the last couple of days ago, that this would suddenly come up Friday or Saturday, sounds a little bit fishy to me, quite frankly. I am not saying that this should not be made a story of, because it is a huge story right now in the United Kingdom. And also because you've asked 67 million people in the United Kingdom to sacrifice, to stay at home. You had many, many people who had to say goodbye forever to their loved ones via iPad, through FaceTime, through Zoom, through Skype. And people who did not have that technology or who did not have online access, who weren't even fortunate enough because of the digital divide, because of the poverty, because of the racism that exists, they could not say goodbye in any way, shape, or form. So their relatives died alone. Their husband died alone. Their wife died alone. Their mother or father died alone. Their brother or sister died alone. Their grandparent died alone. This is what is at issue. This is why people are so angry. And I definitely share that anger. Dominic Cummings says, well, I had to get my child, and I was worried about my child, and I was sick, and he had coronavirus symptoms. His wife actually had come down with the virus itself, from what we know in news accounts. And together they drove up north with their child. They were looking to make sure that their child didn't get sick. And they wanted to be able to have someone who could take care of their child. That's what he's saying. Now, as I'm recording this on Memorial Day, and I'm recording it on the very same day, which is a bank holiday in the United Kingdom. And on this bank holiday, Dominic Cummings is going to make a statement and take questions about all of this. This is going to be very interesting. Boris Johnson's press conference yesterday was an absolute nightmare. And as you heard in that clip, he really did not have any answers. And quite frankly, that was the tenor of the entire news conference, press briefing, as it related to this whole situation with Dominic Cummings. So Dominic Cummings is going to make a statement at some point on this day. And certainly I will be looking at that and reacting to it in a future podcast episode. But the thing that also makes this situation an issue for many people in the United Kingdom is that you had at least 2 prior officials connected to Boris Johnson who were part of a task force, or at least connected to the United Kingdom. 2 officials, one of which actually was with the Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. Dr. Catherine Calderwood was the chief medical officer for the Scottish First Minister. She had broken the lockdown rules because she went and visited a second home, which is not permitted under the lockdown rules. After an initial backing of the doctor by First Minister Nicola Sturgeon up in Scotland, there was an about-face, a further discussion, and the doctor agreed to tender her resignation. She decided to do that. And then she resigned. That was back in April. Around the time, I guess, not far from the time that Dominic Cummings certainly did break the very same laws for lockdown. The other thing is that there was just earlier this month, 3 weeks ago, Dr. Neil Ferguson, who was an advisor and who did the science on the coronavirus and was providing some very important bits of information for Boris Johnson's government, had himself broken lockdown rules. He had a married woman visiting his apartment in London. And obviously, and I believe Dr. Ferguson maybe married himself. But I'm not here to opine on anybody's morality and anybody's personal choices. I'm only saying what happened and the circumstances. And when that came out and that was disclosed, Dr. Ferguson tendered his resignation and resigned almost immediately. People were talking about how much of a great loss Dr. Ferguson was, and that his expertise would not be part of what's going on anymore. So he broke the lockdown rules, he resigned. The Scottish First Minister's chief medical officer broke the rules, she resigned. My question is, why didn't Dominic Cummings resign? My question is, why didn't Boris Johnson give Dominic Cummings the sack? I think the reason why Dominic Cummings is still there is because Dominic Cummings is a very powerful figure. I think Dominic Cummings is a, quite frankly, very sinister figure. I think Dominic Cummings is there to fulfill an agenda that does not favor the interests of the British public. That is my read on Dominic Cummings. If you or I had broken the lockdown rules in the UK, we would be subject to fines. We would be subject to arrest. If we had a workplace policy, and that workplace policy made it very clear if during the course of this lockdown you broke these rules, you face being terminated from your position. And if it were to be found credibly that we had in fact done that, broken the rules, we would have forfeited our employment if that was indeed a condition of our remaining employed at the job that we had. So obviously, Dominic Cummings should never be exempt from that. And the only reason he would be exempt from that would be if he was a very powerful person, would be if he has some information on Boris Johnson that we don't know, but that could be extremely damaging to Boris Johnson. Would be that if there is an agenda that Dominic Cummings, the man behind the scenes who's not so much behind the scenes, needs to fulfill. And I think that's really at the heart of why a lot of Conservative MPs have come out so strongly against Dominic Cummings. In fact, more strongly than a lot of the opposition Labour Party has. I mean, obviously some of them have come out clearly and said, many of them have come out and said, Dominic Cummings must go. There's no question about it. But even Sir Keir Starmer had, up until late yesterday, been, I wouldn't say equivocal, that's a little bit harsh on Sir Keir. But I would say that he had not called explicitly for Dominic Cummings to be sacked, for Dominic Cummings to lose his job. Except for one statement that he made when he said, if I were the Prime Minister, I would have sacked Dominic Cummings. So, I mean, that's pretty much Sir Keir Starmer saying, and he is the opposition Labour leader. He is the leader of the Labour Party. So that's pretty much the closest that Sir Keir has come to saying, yes, Dominic Cummings must go. But Dominic Cummings poses a greater danger. This is more than just about him breaking laws. This is also about a rogue operation in government, someone who is not liked by the Conservatives. Dominic Cummings has had a long track record of very notoriously dangerous and slimy political operations and things that he's done. He was one of the people behind Vote Leave. Vote Leave had committed infractions, some of them which subjected to the organization to a fine and a ruling against them by the Electoral Commission. There was some critical there was a court case against them. I mean, there were all kinds of things going on with the Vote Leave campaign, which were not above board. Dominic Cummings was the engineer of that. There was even an HBO movie made on Dominic Cummings. I mean, it probably was a movie, to the best of my memory, that was based with a London company. But it was here in the United States. It was shown here on air on HBO. Benedict Cumberbatch actually played Dominic Cummings. So this guy's had a movie made on him, at least one dramatic movie made on him. And I dare say documentaries have been or will be whenever they can be made again. But it will be very interesting to see what happens. And I think this goes a whole lot deeper than everything that we are being told. And I don't think the press, as notoriously thorough as the British press can be when it wants to be, I don't think they're digging deep enough here. The British press has a reputation of being very thorough. Notoriously so, which I think is good because we aren't here in the United States. But my native country has always had a tradition of really being forensic. Now, of course, there are huge exceptions to that in a number of instances that I could travel through time and lay out. But I simply don't have that kind of time today to do that. But what I think must happen here is a deeper dive into what's really going on. And I definitely think one of the things that's going on is a plot to distract the public from the fact that we have 38,000 people at least who have died from this virus. And that if we have a scandal, you can just take the public's mind off it. The fact that we in this Boris Johnson Tory government have failed. Boris Johnson has totally failed here. The messaging has been terrible. The mixed messaging. The hypocrisy. And I think that this is part of what's really going on. The other part is the dark arts, if you will, of Dominic Cummings and the hypocrisy around him not being fired. And the other thing even below that, that's not even being talked about anywhere in the British press, is the idea and is the reality that this is about, in my view, a complete destruction of the government. This is about Dominic Cummings engineering a complete takedown of government. Boris Johnson and the cabinet that he presently has, let's not forget this, is one of the most right-wing, reactionary cabinets that we have ever seen in the United Kingdom. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary. We've got Matt Hancock, of course, who he and another officer, I believe it was the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, who was saying, we need herd immunity. That would be the great strategy to let this thing wash over the population, not unlike Donald Trump. Hate the fact I had to mention his name on a day like this, since he loves to play golf while people die. But this herd immunity that Chris Whitty had to retract under the tremendous scrutiny of the British public and press, look at how well that's going for Sweden. How is that working out for them? So many people have died in Sweden who didn't need to. And this is what Chris Whitty was advocating. They've got wave after wave in Sweden of people dying. And all around the world, this virus is taking lives. And I think on this Memorial Day, we should also remember that the entire planet has succumbed to this virus. Many, many people around the world have lost their lives. We're talking on the order of 400,000 people. And I dare say it's a whole lot more. You've got people in the United Kingdom, scientists, who are saying that right now it's at least 60,000 people dead from this virus. And that's what? If I do my math correctly, what is that? 1% of the population? Just about? That is a lot of people. I think that these things have to be remembered. And that's where I worry about this Dominic Cummings situation. Because on the one hand, he should go. I totally agree. He's got to go. And Boris Johnson did not have the backbone yesterday to fire him, and he should have. Which tells me now that the real Prime Minister at number 10 Downing Street is Dominic Cummings. It is unprecedented for an aide an aide to any prime minister to be holding a press conference. You never ever really see that at all. And the press conference be about him. Not that you don't see aides hold press conferences. You may well, but they're usually talking about the prime minister, if that ever happens. This happens in the United States, where, particularly for political candidates, they may hold a press briefing or issue a statement or have a press conference if the candidate or politician isn't there. We see this with the White House press briefings, who their briefings have magically returned after nearly 2 years away. But it is very, very unusual for an aide to hold a press conference and the subject matter be about the aide. And what I fear will now happen is the media circus, and again, this needs to be talked about in the media, but I think this is now going to take the public's mind away from the fact that there's still PPE that is not being delivered to nurses on the front lines. And we're still having deaths all over the United Kingdom and all over the world, but specifically because I'm focusing on the UK, all over the United Kingdom, people are still dying. And that is going to, if the media keeps pushing, which they should, on Dominic Cummings, I am really concerned that they're not going to also focus still on those many thousands of people who've lost their lives and continue to lose lives in this country, the United Kingdom, all over the region, whether it's England, whether it's Northern Ireland, whether it is Scotland, whether it is Wales. I fear the focus will go. I think that the press and the media are able and capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time. You can cover Dominic Cummings and yet still cover the urgent need for PPE for nurses. If you want to talk about sacrifice, look no further than the National Health Service, which the Tories, by the way, have destroyed over the last 10 years, if not more. At the same time yesterday, there were stories about the schools not being properly given the kinds of backing. In fact, not only that, there were reports out that the UK government, Boris Johnson's Tory government, wanted to cut services, wanted to cut things to schools in the midst of a pandemic. Sometimes when big scandals happen, they aren't happening just because they've exploded in your face. Sometimes they're happening to obscure something else over there somewhere. Sometimes that is what is happening. I do think that the fact that these rules have been broken, the fact that Boris Johnson, who himself was close to death last month, Boris Johnson was close to death last month. Have people forgotten that he spent 3 days in intensive care at St. Thomas Hospital in London? The fact that Boris Johnson had been giving out these murky instructions, and he went from stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives, to stay alert, control the virus, save lives, shows you that he himself has very little regard for the English and British public at large. Shows you that he didn't care enough. In fact, we know that the Sunday Times of London had a tremendous story last month about Boris Johnson not going to Cobra meetings, which are high-level, top-security government meetings. that he had skipped attendance to at least 5 or 6 of them before finally going to one in the early part of March. So these Cobra meetings were about the coronavirus. So Boris Johnson apparently, well, not even apparently, it's just factual. It's factual. It's been reported in the Sunday Times. Boris Johnson was in no hurry to address this serious situation that was killing people all over the UK. He was busy with his fiancée, Carrie Simmons. There is something deeply psychopathic about this, all of this. There is something deeply sociopathic about all of this. All of this. And I do think that the fact that Cummings is doing what he's doing, and the fact that Boris Johnson's not getting rid of him, and the fact that Boris Johnson's rules, or the rules written up by Cummings, have been deliberately vague to confuse and disorient people in the UK, and to also undermine their confidence and trust in government, certainly in this Tory government, is a deliberate and calculated function of Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings to undermine confidence in government and to degrade government in the same way that we have over here with the Republicans and the guy in the White House, who are deliberately destroying government and destroying the apparatus of the administrative state. I think the same thing is happening in the UK. And I think that is the real story that should be explored and should be investigated and looked into. And I think that the chief architect behind this dismantling of government that I think is happening in the UK right now is one Dominic Cummings. I think that's why he is still in his position today. Thank you very much for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.